friends, Mrs. Reed, back to share another chapter of Charlotte's Web, written by E.B. White. Today we're going to be reading chapter 3. And if you recall from chapter 2, Fern was asked by her father to sell Wilbur for only $6. And he suggested selling Wilbur, her pig friend, to her uncle, Mr. Zuckerman. So, let's find out what happens in chapter 3. This is a little bit longer of a chapter, so I'm going to try to read this one straight through without my normal commentary. So, as usual, sit back, relax, and find your comfy place, and get ready to be a listener. Chapter 3. The Escape. The barn was very large. It was very old, and it smelled of hay, and it smelled of manure. It smelled of the perspiration of tired horses, and the wonderful sweet breath of patient cows. It often had the sort of peaceful smell, as though nothing bad could ever happen in the world. It smelled of grain, and of harness dressing, and the axle grease of rubber boots, and of new rope. And whenever a cat was given a fish head to eat, the barn would smell of fish. But mostly, it smelled of hay, for there was always hay up in the great loft up overhead. And there was always hay being pitched down to the cows and the horses and the sheep. The barn was pleasantly warm in the winter, when the animals spent most of their time indoors. And it was pleasantly cool in the summertime, when the big doors stood open and there was a lovely breeze, which there is today. The barn had stalls on the main floors, which are these floors right here. And it had tie-ups for the workhorses on the main floor and for the cows. And there was a sheepfold down below for the sheep, and a pig pen down below for Wilbur. So underneath the main floor, there's like a basement or a cellar. And there were all sorts of things that you would find in barns, like ladders and grindstones, pitchforks and monkey wrenches, scythes and lawn mowers, snow shovels, axe handles, milk pails, water buckets, empty grain sacks, and rusty rat traps. A scythe is a kind of tool that one would use to maybe cut wheat or grass. It has a wooden stick, arm, and then a curved, sharp blade on the top. It was a kind of barn that swallows, which are a type of bird, like to build their nests in. It was the kind of barn that children liked to play in. My brothers and I lived with a barn attached to our house, and we liked to play in it too. And the whole thing was owned by Fern's uncle, Mr. Homer L. Zuckerman. Wilbur's new home was in the lower part of the barn, directly underneath the cows. Mr. Zuckerman knew that a manure pile is a good place to keep a young pig. Pigs need warmth, and it was warm and it was comfortable down there in the barn cellar on the south side. Fern came almost every day to visit him. She found an old milking stool that had been discarded, and so she placed it in the stool of the sheepfold right next to Wilbur's pig pen. And here she sat quietly during the long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. That's Wilbur eating from his trough, and that's Fern quietly just observing him. She looks very thoughtful. The sheep soon got to know her and trust her, and so did the geese who lived with the sheep. All the animals trusted her. She was so quiet and so friendly. Mr. Zuckerman did not allow her to take Wilbur out, and He did not allow her to get into the pig pen. But he told Fern that she could sit on the stool and she could watch Wilbur as long as she wanted to. It made her happy just to be near the pig, and it made Wilbur happy to know that she was sitting there outside his pen. But he never had any fun, no walks, no rides, no swims anymore. Then one afternoon in June, when Wilbur was almost 2 months old, he wandered out of his small little yard outside the barn. Fern had not arrived for her usual visit. Wilbur stood in the sun, feeling lonely and bored. There's never anything to do around here, he thought. And he slowly wandered over to his food trough, and he sniffed to see if there was anything that he had overlooked at lunchtime. He found a small strip of potato skin and he ate it. His back kind of itched, so he leaned against the fence and he rubbed it against the boards. And when he tired of this, he walked indoors and he climbed to the top of the manure pile and he sat down. Sounds a little stinky. He didn't feel like going to sleep. He didn't feel like digging, and he was tired of standing still and tired of just lying down. I'm less than 2 months old, and I'm tired of living already. Oh, poor Wilbur, he had said. He walked out to the yard again. When I'm out here, he said, there's no place to go but in, and when I'm indoors, there's no place to go but out in the yard. That's where you're wrong, my friends. My friend? Whose voice was that? Wilbur looked through the fence and he saw a goose standing there. You don't have to stay in that dirty little yard, said the goose, who talked rather fast. One of the boards is loose. Just push on it, and come out. What? Said Wilbur. Say it slower. Oh, so she talks fast and she kind of repeats herself. At the risk of repeating myself, said the goose, I suggest that you come out. It's wonderful out here. Did you say there was a board loose? That I did, said the goose. Wilbur walked up to the fence and saw that the goose was right. One board was loose. He put his head down and he shut his eyes and he pushed. The board gave way, and in a minute he had squeezed through the fence and he was standing in the long grass outside of his yard. The goose chuckled. How does it feel to be free? I like it, said Wilbur. That is, I guess I like it. I like it, said Wilbur. He sounded a little bit unsure. Actually, Wilbur felt a little queer to be outside of his fence with nothing between him and the big, big world. Remember, the word queer means a little bit, it means to feel unusual. Where do you think I'd better go? Anywhere you'd like, said the goose. She suggested, go down through the orchard, root up the sod, go down through the garden and dig up the radishes. Root up everything, eat grass, look for corn. She's got a whole big plan. Look for oats, run all over, skip and dance, jump and prance, go down through the orchard and stroll through the woods. The world is a wonderful place and you're so young. I can see that, said Wilbur. He gave a jump in the air and he twirled and he ran a few steps. He stopped and he looked all around and he sniffed all the smells of the afternoon, and then he set off walking down to the orchard. Pausing in the shade of an apple tree, he put his strong snout into the ground and he began pushing and digging and rooting. That's what rooting means. He felt very happy. He had plowed up quite a piece of ground before anybody had noticed him. Mrs. Zuckerman was the first to see him. She saw him from the kitchen window, and she immediately shouted for the men, meaning the men who probably help at the farm. "Homer!" she cried. "Pigs out! Lurvy! Pigs out! Homer! Lurvy! The pig's out!" "He's down there under that apple tree." "Now the trouble starts," thought Wilbur. "Now I'm going to catch it," meaning probably get in trouble. The goose heard the racket too, and she started hollering, "Run, run, run! Down the hill! Make for the woods! Make for the woods!" She shouted to Wilbur. "They'll never catch you in the woods." The Cocker Spaniel heard the commotion, and he ran out of the barn to join the chase. Mr. Zuckerman heard, and he came out of the machine shed where he was mending a tool. Lurvy, one of the men who worked for him, heard the noise, and he came up from the asparagus patch. I love asparagus. Where he was pulling weeds. Everybody walked towards Wilbur, and Wilbur just didn't know what to do. The woods seemed a long way off, and anyway, he'd never been down there in the woods, and he wasn't sure that he would actually like it. "Get around behind him, Lurvy," said Mr. Zuckerman. "Try to drive him towards the barn. And take it easy, don't rush him. And I'll go get a bucket of slop." I bet you know what slop might be. Pig food. The news of Wilbur's escape spread rapidly among the animals in the place. Whenever any creature broke loose on Zuckerman's farm, the event was of great interest to the other animals. The goose had shouted to the nearest cow that Wilbur was free, and soon all the cows knew. They sound rather gossipy. And the lambs had learned about it from their mothers, and the horses in their stalls and the barns picked up their ears, and they heard the goose hollering. And as soon as the horses caught on to what was happening, "Wilbur's out," they said, and every animal stirred, and they lifted their heads and became excited to know that one of his friends had gotten free and was no longer penned up or tied up fast. Wilbur didn't know what to do or which way to run. It seemed as if everyone was after him. "If this is what it's like to be free," he thought, "I believe I'd rather be penned up in my own yard." The Cocker Spaniel, a dog, was sneaking up on him from one side, and Lurvy was sneaking up on him from another side, and Mrs. Zuckerman stood ready to head him off if he had started down towards the garden. And now Mr. Zuckerman was coming down toward him, carrying a pail. "Ooh, this is really awful," thought Wilbur. "Why doesn't Fern come?" He began to cry. This is Mr. and Miss Lurvy and Mrs. Zuckerman trying to carefully approach Wilbur. So, I like that they're being careful and not trying to scare him. They just want him to come back home so he's safe. The goose took command and began to give orders. "Don't just stand there, Wilbur. Dodge about, cried the goose. "Skip around, run towards me, slip in and out, in and out, in and out. Make for the woods, twist and turn." The Cocker Spaniel sprang for Wilbur's hind leg. Wilbur jumped and ran. Lurvy reached out and he grabbed Mrs. Zuckerman. Mrs. Zuckerman screamed at Lurvy. The goose cheered for Wilbur. Wilbur dodged between Lurvy's legs, and Lurvy missed Wilbur and grabbed the spaniel instead. Nicely done, cried the goose. Try it again. Run downhill, suggested the cows. Run towards me, yelled the goose. Run uphill, said the sheep. Turn and twist, honked the goose. Jump and dance, said the rooster. That's quite an animated group of animals on that farm. It's quite a little hot mess. Look out for Lurvy, called the cows. Look out for Zuckerman, called the gander. Watch out for the dog, cried the sheep. Listen to me, said the goose. Poor Wilbur was dazed and frightened and confused by all of this hullabaloo. He didn't like being the center of all this fuss. He tried to follow the instructions of his friends they were giving him to go running up the hill and down the hill. And at the same time, he just couldn't turn and twist. And when he was jumping, dancing, and he was crying, and it was so hard to see, and he was so confused. After all, Wilbur was a very young pig. Not much more, really, than a baby. He really wished that Fern were there to take him in her arms and comfort him. He needs a Fern hug. When he looked up and he saw Mr. Zuckerman standing quite close to him, holding a pail of warm slops, he kind of felt relieved. He lifted his nose and he sniffed, and the smell was delicious. Warm milk, potatoes, wheat middlings, Kellogg's cornflakes, a popover from the Zuckerman's breakfast. "Come, Pig," said Mr. Zuckerman, tapping on the pail. "Come on, Pig." Wilbur took a step towards the pail. "No, no, no," said the goose. "It's an old pail trick, Wilbur. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. He's trying to lure you back to captivity. Ivity. He's appealing to your stomach." Wilbur didn't care. The food smelled so appetizing. He took another step towards the pail. "Pig, pig," said Mr. Zuckerman in a kind voice. "Oop." He said, "Pig, pig," in a kind voice. He didn't yell it. And he began walking slowly towards the barnyard. "Come on, Pig. Come on." He was looking all about him very innocently, as if he didn't even know that a little white pig was following along behind him. "You'll be sorry, sorry, sorry," called the goose. Wilbur didn't care. He kept walking towards that pail of slops. "You'll miss your freedom," honked the goose. "And your hour of freedom is worth a barrel of slops." Wilbur didn't care. When Mr. Zuckerman reached the pig pen, he climbed over the fence and he poured the slops into the trough. Then he pulled the loose board away from the fence so that there was a wide hole for Wilbur to walk through. "Oh. Reconsider, reconsider," cried the goose. Wilbur paid no attention. He stepped through the fence into his yard. He walked to the trough and he took long drinks of slop, sucking the milk hungrily and chewing on the popover. It was good to be home again. While Wilbur ate, Lurvy fetched a hammer and some 8-penny nails, and he put the board back in place. Then he and Mr. Zuckerman leaned lazily on the fence. Mr. Zuckerman scratched Wilbur's back with a stick. "He's quite a pig," said Lurvy. "Yeah, he'll make a good pig," said Mr. Zuckerman. Wilbur heard the words of praise. He felt the warm milk in his stomach. He felt the pleasant rubbing of the stick on his itchy back. And he felt peaceful and happy and sleepy. This had been a tiring afternoon. It was still only about 4 o'clock, but Wilbur was ready for bed. "I'm really too young to go out into the world alone," he said to himself. And then he laid down and took a long nap. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 3. Thanks for tuning in again and being a great listener. Come back for chapter 4.